Rachel Thompson's Saturdays were rare, fleeting breaths of freedom. Her weekdays belonged to the courtroom, an arena where justice was as elusive as it was essential, and where every decision she made could ripple through lives and destinies. But today, this Saturday morning was different. Today was only for her boys, Liam and Oliver, and the peace of a neighborhood path beneath a clear, cloudless sky. The sun poured golden light over their little suburban world, dappling the street with shadows cast by the towering oaks lining their quiet path. Rachel watched her son's laughter dart across the air, as bright as the sunlight that gilded the scene. Liam, the older at 8, was filled with boundless curiosity. At that moment, he was chasing after a bird that danced from one low branch to another, his giggles as swift as his feet. Oliver, just 5, was the quiet one, more watchful, his small fingers clinging to Rachel's hand with gentle but determined trust. To anyone else, the three might have looked mismatched, with her rich brown skin against their fair complexions, her tight curls contrasting with their soft, straight hair. She knew that curious glances sometimes followed them, people's eyes lingering too long as they tried to piece together the picture. But today, none of that mattered. Here, among the scent of newly cut grass and the faint buzz of distant lawnmowers, Rachel felt free. She wasn't Judge Thompson, civil rights champion or unyielding pillar of justice. She was just Rachel, a mom soaking in her children's laughter under a warm autumn sun. "Mom, look." Liam's voice jolted her from her thoughts. He pointed toward a squirrel scrambling up a tree, his face flushed with excitement. Rachel smiled, nodding as though she hadn't seen 1,000 squirrels before. But this one was special because he saw it. She felt her heart swell as she watched them, a mix of pride and protectiveness. Liam and Oliver were her boys, her life. They didn't look at her with questions of race or difference, they only saw their mother. And for Rachel, that was all she ever needed. But as they rounded the corner onto a quieter street, Rachel's serenity unraveled. The hum of an approaching car broke through the birdsong and laughter. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing the dark form of a police car creeping down the road behind them. Instinctively, she gripped Oliver's hand a little tighter, feeling a familiar knot form in her stomach. Just a routine patrol, she whispered to herself, a hopeful assurance more than a fact. Police were common enough here, a sign of the neighborhood's quiet safety. Yet this car didn't pass. It slowed, hovering just a few paces away, and then stopped, its silent, shadowed presence thickening the air. Rachel swallowed hard, her breath tightening. She told herself to stay calm, to keep her focus. She'd been in situations like this before. She knew the unwelcome, simmering undercurrent that could turn a peaceful day into something darker. But not here, not with her boys. 2 officers emerged from the vehicle. The first, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face like carved stone, approached with heavy footsteps that seemed to crackle in the stillness. The second officer trailed slightly behind, younger, a hint of uncertainty in his movements, as though he were bracing himself. Rachel felt her heartbeat quicken, but she fought to keep her expression steady, her shoulders straight. She didn't want her sons to sense her unease. Liam was still pointing out things in the trees, oblivious, while Oliver glanced curiously between his mother and the approaching officers. Sensing the shift, "Ma'am," the first officer spoke, his tone sharp, eyes narrow. "Are these your children?" Rachel's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady, even gentle. "Yes, they're my sons." The officer's gaze flickered with something Rachel recognized all too well, suspicion. An unspoken accusation. She had seen it countless times in courtrooms, in the gazes of those who felt entitled to doubt her, judge her, define her. Before she could respond further, the second officer, younger and visibly uncomfortable, chimed in hesitantly. Where did you get them?" The question hit her like a slap, each word as biting as it was absurd. Where did you get them? As though her sons were objects, possessions to be questioned, to be doubted. 1,000 replies rushed to her mind, some sharp, others defiant. But instead, she drew a breath, feeling her anger press against the limits of her restraint. "I adopted them," she replied, her voice steady but firm, her gaze fixed on the officers. The silence that followed was thick and tense, and Rachel could feel her son's eyes on her. Liam's laughter had stopped, replaced with a curious, questioning gaze. Oliver's small hand was trembling slightly in her grip. The officer's gaze shifted, hardening. "Can we see some ID?" His voice was now more demanding, an edge to his words that hinted he was ready to escalate at the slightest provocation. Rachel's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the moment, the fragility of the peace she had hoped to protect. The thought of refusing flared in her mind, but she knew all too well what that could mean. She'd presided over cases like this, seen how a small spark could ignite into something far more dangerous. "Why do you need to see my ID?" she asked, her tone calm. "Careful. We're just out for a walk." The officer's stance shifted, and his partner fidgeted, glancing away as if he wished to disappear. Rachel saw her boys' expressions change, confusion clouding their young faces. And in that moment, her calm felt as fragile as glass. "It's our job to check," he said flatly, his gaze cold, dismissive, a chill rolling through the golden morning. Rachel's mind raced, weighing her options, feeling her son's small hands as they gripped hers with trust and innocence, unaware that, for a moment, the world had shifted against them. And, in that fragile moment, Rachel knew this was only the beginning. Rachel kept her grip firm on Oliver's hand, her fingers curling protectively around his. Her heartbeat thrummed in her chest, steady but quick, like a silent metronome marking each second. She glanced down at her sons, her gaze meeting Liam's curious, uncomprehending eyes. He didn't know yet, couldn't fully understand why these officers had stopped them. Oliver sensed the tension too, his small fingers gripping hers even tighter, a quiet, frightened question in his wide eyes. "Ma'am, I asked to see your ID." The officer's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet suburban morning. His partner shifted behind him, casting a sideways glance that hinted at unease. Though he remained silent, Rachel noticed the younger officer's nervousness, the way his gaze flitted to her boys and then back to the older officer, as though he were waiting for some unseen line to be crossed. Rachel drew a steadying breath, feeling the weight of her position and all it had taught her about encounters like these. She was no stranger to power dynamics, to the subtle tensions that could sway them in an instant. As a judge, she was used to commanding the room. Yet here, on this quiet street with her boys, she felt the familiar, sour undercurrent of prejudice threatening to erode the peace. "Is there a reason you need to see my ID?" she asked, her tone calm but resolute. "I'm just here with my children." The older officer's gaze hardened. His eyes flicked to her sons, then back to her, carrying with them a skepticism that was hard to miss. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. Just doing our job," he replied, the words measured but cold, as though it were a well-rehearsed line he'd spoken 100 times. Rachel felt a quiet anger flicker inside her. Suspicious activity? Her crime, it seemed, was walking through her own neighborhood with her children. But she knew that pushing back too hard could turn this tense encounter into something uglier. She glanced at Liam, who was now watching the officers with a frown, his face thoughtful as though trying to puzzle out the pieces of an equation that didn't make sense. "Mom, are we in trouble?" he asked, his voice young and brave, yet laced with a flicker of uncertainty that broke her heart. "No, sweetheart, we're not," Rachel replied, forcing a calm smile to reassure him, though she could feel her patience wearing thin. She looked back at the officers, her tone edged with quiet defiance. "I'm not doing anything wrong, and neither are my children." The younger officer, still behind his partner, shifted uncomfortably, his face pale and unsure. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he remained silent, his lips pressed tightly together. Rachel caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes and realized he was at a crossroads, hovering between duty and a buried sense of morality. The older officer, however, showed no such hesitation. His tone sharpened, and his gaze grew colder, the edges of his authority tightening.
Look,
"Ma'am," he said, each word weighted with an unmistakable threat. "We just need to make sure everything's in order.
now."
Are you going to make this easy? Or are we going to have a problem?" Rachel clenched her teeth, feeling a surge of defiance rise up within her. This was her neighborhood, her family, her life. She knew that technically, she had every right to refuse, that she was under no legal obligation to present ID for merely existing in her own neighborhood. But she also knew how quickly things could spiral. She took a slow, deliberate breath, weighing her options, the urge to protect her sons pulling hard at her heart. "This is unnecessary," she said, her tone firmer now. "We're just a family out for a walk. I'd like to continue enjoying our morning without disruption." The older officer took a step closer, his face hardening, as if her resistance alone were an act of defiance that he couldn't tolerate. "Maybe you don't understand,
Ma'am.
but we're going to do this one way or another." His hand moved subtly toward his belt, and for a brief moment, Rachel saw his fingers hovering near the handcuffs, as though he were daring her to make this difficult. The tension thickened, stretching across the morning air. Rachel's heart pounded, her breath shallow, yet her resolve hardened. She looked into the officer's eyes, unwavering. "You're overstepping," she said softly, her voice threaded with authority she'd earned in courtrooms across the city. "We're simply walking in our own neighborhood. There's no law that prohibits that." The officer's expression tightened, a glint of anger flashing across his eyes. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a black woman who didn't fit his expectations. For a fleeting second, Rachel felt the weight of her role as a judge, the responsibility she held, the strength she carried. Before the officer could respond, Liam's small voice piped up, breaking through the heavy silence. "Why do you need her ID?" he asked, his voice small but clear, his eyes fixed on the officer. The innocence in his question, the unvarnished bravery in his tone, made Rachel's heart clench. The officer ignored Liam, his eyes still locked on Rachel, but she could feel the young boy's question reverberate in the air, stirring the quiet truth that lingered between them. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," Rachel said, a quiet calm settling over her. "But my children don't deserve this treatment. And neither do I.
Now.
Unless you have a legitimate reason, I'd prefer to continue our day." A flicker of hesitation crossed the younger officer's face. His gaze shifted from Rachel to his partner, a faint doubt surfacing, and she could see he was grappling with his own discomfort. Yet he remained silent, choosing complicity over courage. The older officer leaned in, his gaze cold, his voice laced with a final warning. "I'm going to ask one last time.
Ma'am.
Show us your ID, or we take you in." It's as simple as that. Rachel's pulse pounded, her mind racing with the implications. She knew she could stand her ground, refuse to comply, and she had every right to. But the image of her children watching her be placed in handcuffs, the trauma it would carve into their young hearts, was something she couldn't bear. Slowly, reluctantly, she reached into her pocket, her fingers grazing the familiar leather of her wallet. She could feel the officers watching her, their authority pressing down like a weight, but she wouldn't let them break her spirit. She held her head high, her voice steady. "I'm a judge," she said, the words falling like stones in the still air. She pulled out her ID, holding it out in front of her, her gaze steady as she met the officer's eyes. "And I know my rights." The words hung heavy, a quiet defiance that rippled through the tension. The older officer's face faltered for a fraction of a second, and, in that pause, Rachel saw the truth that he had expected her to back down, to give in without question. For a moment, silence stretched between them, taut as a thread, as Rachel held her ID with an unshakable calm. This was her stand, her line in the sand, the strength she had cultivated over years of fighting battles just like this one. Rachel watched the officers' faces shift, saw the doubt flicker in the eyes of the younger one. For a second, she felt a swell of control return to her as her ID hung between them, a symbol of who she was and what she had worked her entire life to become. Judge Rachel Thompson, an authority in her own right, a fighter for justice, someone who didn't bow easily. She had learned, through hard battles, that sometimes just standing your ground could shift the balance of power. But here, on this sidewalk, with her sons at her side, the stakes felt higher and the line more fragile. The older officer recovered quickly, his expression hardening as though he'd rehearsed this moment, as though her title meant nothing. His fingers twitched near his belt, a silent threat she recognized immediately. "You may be a judge, ma'am," he said, voice cool and sharp, "but that doesn't mean you're above the law." He squared his shoulders, eyes narrowing as he stared her down. "We've had a report, and I'm doing my job, judge or not." Rachel's jaw clenched, her patience thinning, but she forced herself to stay calm, her voice steady. "You're not doing your job. You're acting on assumptions. And you know it." Her words were controlled, but the anger simmered beneath them. She thought of her boys, of every day spent teaching them about kindness and fairness, about trusting the police, the courts, the people meant to protect. And yet here they were, witnessing their mother challenged as if her very identity were a crime. Oliver tugged gently at her hand, and she looked down, meeting his wide, questioning eyes. She gave his hand a soft squeeze, silently willing him to stay close, to stay strong, while Liam's gaze flitted back and forth, confusion etched into his young face. The world wasn't making sense to him, and it hurt her to see that truth settle there.
Mom.
"Why don't they just believe you?" he whispered, the innocence in his question cutting her deeply. She forced a small, reassuring smile, though her heart pounded fiercely.
"Sometimes.
People don't understand what's right, Liam," she replied, softly enough for only him to hear. "But that doesn't mean we don't stand up for ourselves." The older officer's voice broke the moment, his tone sharpened with irritation. "Judge or not, we're going to need you to comply." He glanced down at her ID, but not before giving her a once-over that made her feel as if he saw only the color of her skin, dismissing everything else. Rachel took a slow, controlled breath. She had options. Of course, she could stand her ground, turn this moment into a standoff, show her boys the strength in resistance. She could demand a reason for their questioning, call for a superior, make a scene. But she also knew her boys were watching, too young, wide-eyed children who were absorbing every second of this moment, this injustice. She looked back up at the officer, her eyes steady and calm. "You know who I am now," she said, voice firm. "I've given you everything you asked for. My children and I are leaving." She took a small step forward, placing herself slightly ahead of Liam and Oliver, silently creating a shield between her boys and the officers. Her heart raced, but she held herself tall, projecting a calm she didn't entirely feel. For a moment, she thought they might let her go. She saw the hesitation flicker in the younger officer's eyes, a sliver of doubt that seemed ready to surface. But the older officer clenched his jaw, his gaze hardening. "Not yet, Judge," he said coldly. "I'll tell you when you're free to go." Rachel's hands tightened, frustration burning through her. She took a deep breath, reminding herself who she was: a judge, a mother, a woman who had spent her life fighting these battles. But with her children by her side, she knew she couldn't let her anger rise, couldn't afford to let this escalate. She looked directly into the officer's eyes, calm but unyielding. "What exactly do you think I've done?" she asked, her voice steady and unafraid. "I'm here with my children, in my neighborhood, doing nothing but enjoying a Saturday morning. So tell me, what makes me so suspicious?" Her question hung in the air, echoing with a truth they couldn't ignore. The younger officer shifted, visibly uncomfortable, his gaze flitting to his partner as if seeking permission to back down. But the older officer's face remained impassive, his hand resting close to his belt, his stance unyielding. "Suspicious activity in the area, Judge," he replied, his words laced with a chilling finality. "And you fit the description." Rachel nearly laughed at the absurdity, but the anger flared too strongly, simmering beneath her composure. She knew that description was as vague as it was unfounded, a code meant to justify their doubts, to create suspicion where none belonged. But she kept her tone steady, refusing to let them see the cracks in her calm. "My sons are frightened," she said quietly, shifting her gaze to the younger officer, searching his face for a glimmer of humanity. "Surely you can see that. We're not causing any harm. We're just a family, out for a walk." The younger officer's expression softened. Just for a second, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but his partner cut him off with a sharp look, a wordless warning to stay silent. Rachel could see the younger man's conflict, the struggle between duty and a conscience that was being tested. But the older officer, unmoved, took a small step closer, his expression hardening. "We're only here to ensure everyone's safety," he said. His voice clipped. "If you don't comply,
Judge,
we'll take you in and let the station sort this out." Rachel's heart sank. She could feel her boys' fear growing, their small hands clinging to her like anchors as they sensed the threat looming between them. She didn't want to give in, didn't want to let these men strip her of her dignity in front of her children. But she couldn't let this turn into something her boys would remember with terror and confusion.
slowly.
She looked down at her sons, her heart heavy. "Stay close to me," she murmured, giving them each a small squeeze. Her silent promise that she would protect them, no matter what. She looked back at the officers, her voice steady, her gaze fierce. "This is harassment," she said, her words laced with quiet fury. "You're standing here, accusing me of a crime I didn't commit, of things I didn't do, just because of the way I look. And you both know it." The younger officer's face flushed, his eyes dropping to the ground, shame flickering across his features. Rachel saw it, the silent admission in his eyes, the guilt that was beginning to sink in. But the older officer met her gaze, his expression still cold, unyielding. "You're free to file a complaint," he said flatly. "But right now, you'll do as I say." Rachel's pulse quickened, the urge to fight back bubbling just beneath her calm. She was a judge, a woman who had dedicated her life to justice, to protecting the rights of those who couldn't fight for themselves. Yet here she was, being stripped of her dignity, her power, by men who were supposed to uphold the law. But she knew her boys needed her calm, needed her strength, needed her to protect them from the brutal truth of the world they were just beginning to understand. Taking a steadying breath, Rachel straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. "Then do what you must," she replied, her voice soft but unbreakable, each word a quiet challenge. "But remember this, you're making a mistake you'll regret." For a brief second, the older officer's composure faltered. He blinked, something shifting behind his eyes, a faint shadow of doubt. She held his gaze, unflinching, her own conviction blazing like a quiet fire.
And in that moment,
Rachel knew that she would not back down. Not here. Not in front of her children. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the dignity and strength she had spent a lifetime building. Rachel felt the tension in the air grow sharper, thicker, a weight pressing down on her shoulders. The older officer's face remained hard, unyielding, while the younger officer's expression flickered with unease. Her son's small hands clung to her, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Every part of her ached to comfort them, to wrap them up in a shield of protection. But she knew that shield was slipping away, and the situation was tipping towards something dangerous. The older officer's gaze darkened as he took another step forward. His fingers lingered close to the handcuffs at his belt, his stance radiating authority and impatience. "This is your last chance," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Show me some ID, or we're taking you in, judge or not." The words hit her like a blow. the reality settling over her with a weight that nearly took her breath away. She looked down at her boys, saw the fear in Oliver's trembling hands and the flash of defiant confusion in Liam's eyes. She could almost hear the questions they were too afraid to ask. Why? What did we do wrong? Why are they treating you like this, Mom? Rachel's anger burned beneath her calm, but she held it back, a wall against the growing tide of frustration and disbelief. She'd worked her entire life to be more than what people assumed her to be, to build a reputation of strength and fairness, to be the very thing that others said she could never be.
And now,
Standing here with her sons, it all felt fragile, like something that could shatter at any second. Taking a slow, steady breath, she met the officer's gaze, her voice soft but unwavering. "You're making a mistake," she said, each word laced with a quiet, simmering authority. "But if this is what you need to do, then let's get this over with. My children have been through enough." The officer's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as if she'd challenged him, as if her very existence on this sidewalk was a form of rebellion he couldn't tolerate. He stepped forward, reaching for her arm with a cold finality, and Rachel knew that she had no choice left. As his hand brushed her sleeve, she straightened, her voice clear and strong, each word cutting through the thick, heavy silence. "I am Judge Rachel Thompson," she announced, pulling her ID badge from her pocket, the emblem of her authority gleaming under the morning sun. "Civil Rights Court. Cases of racial discrimination and misconduct. And you are both making a grave error." The silence that followed was deafening. The younger officer's eyes widened in shock, his hand freezing midair as he realized the weight of her words. He glanced at his partner, a flicker of doubt and fear crossing his face. He hadn't expected this. Neither of them had. The older officer's face went slack for a brief second, his grip loosening as he processed her words. Then his eyes narrowed, his expression hardening again, though a sliver of hesitation crept into his gaze. "Being a judge doesn't mean you're exempt from questioning," he replied. But his voice held less certainty, and Rachel could see the cracks in his authority. She held her badge steady, her expression unwavering. "No, it doesn't exempt me, but it does mean I know my rights. I know the law, and I know that what you're doing right now is unlawful harassment." The younger officer's gaze dropped, guilt flickering in his eyes. He looked as though he wanted to disappear, as if the weight of the encounter had finally settled on him, suffocating any remnants of confidence. He took a small step back, the distance a silent admission of his own doubt. The older officer, however, wasn't ready to yield. His pride and authority had been challenged, and he stood his ground, his jaw clenched, his hand still dangerously close to his belt. "We received a call," he said, his tone sharper, as though he were trying to reclaim his grip on the situation. "Suspicious activity involving a black woman and 2 white children. We're just following protocol." Rachel's heart sank at the thinly veiled justification. It wasn't protocol, it was prejudice. And they both knew it. "You have no right to make these assumptions," she replied, her voice low but laced with conviction. "My children and I are not a threat to anyone. We're a family. You've created this situation, and now you're reaching for reasons to justify it." The older officer's face flushed, his authority cracking under the weight of her words. He knew she was right, knew that every justification he offered was hollow, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He took a small, stubborn step forward, his voice dropping to a cold, dismissive tone.
"Look, Judge,
You can file your complaints. Say whatever you want to say later.
right now,
You're going to cooperate." Rachel's patience thinned, her calm wearing away as her sons looked up at her, their faces a mix of fear and uncertainty. She could see the cracks forming in their innocence, see the way they were absorbing every word, every threat, every implication. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I know what you're doing," she said, her tone sharp with controlled anger. "But let me make one thing clear. You are responsible for every action you take here, every threat, every word, and I will hold you accountable for all of it." The younger officer looked away, shame darkening his face. He took a small step back, and Rachel could sense the tension breaking, feel the hesitation creeping into the air between them. For a moment, she thought it might be over, that reason would finally take hold, that the officer's sense of duty would outweigh his stubbornness. But the older officer held his ground, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and humiliation. He wasn't ready to let go, couldn't bear to lose control in front of someone who dared to challenge him. He looked back at her, his tone clipped and unrelenting. "You can leave," he said finally, the words forced from his lips. "But don't think this is over." Rachel didn't flinch. She watched him, her gaze steady and unyielding, her silence a quiet defiance. She knew she had won the battle, but the war, the struggle for justice and dignity, was far from over. Slowly, she took her son's hands, her fingers closing around their small, trembling hands, offering them the reassurance they needed. She looked down at them, forcing a calm smile as she whispered, "It's okay.
Boys.
We're leaving now." Liam looked up at her, his eyes still wide, his young mind struggling to understand the injustice he had witnessed.
Mom.
"Why did they do that?" he asked, his voice small and filled with confusion. Rachel's heart ached, her anger tempered by the need to protect her sons from the harsh truths of the world. She knelt down, looking into their eyes, her voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes people don't understand, and they make wrong decisions," she said softly. "But it's important that we know who we are. We know the truth, and we don't let anyone make us feel less than that." Oliver nodded, still clutching her hand, his small face pressed against her shoulder. Liam's gaze lingered on the officers as they returned to their car, a quiet anger simmering in his young eyes. But he nodded,
2.
his hand tightening around hers. As they walked away, Rachel felt a rush of relief, but it was tainted with a heavy sadness, a bitterness that lingered in her chest. She had protected her children, stood her ground, but the encounter had left scars on her. On them, it was a reminder of the fight that lay ahead, of the work that still needed to be done. She knew she couldn't let this go. This wasn't just about her or her family, it was about every person who had faced these silent, unseen battles, every voice silenced by prejudice. She would file her complaint, pursue justice, make sure that those officers understood the gravity of their actions. This was her promise to herself, to her sons, and to everyone who looked to her for strength and justice. As they walked down the street, the sun casting a warm, golden glow over their path, Rachel held her head high. She was more than a mother, more than a judge. She was a warrior, and she wasn't going to back down.
Not now.
Not ever. Rachel sat on the edge of her bed that night, her mind replaying the encounter over and over like a movie stuck on repeat. She could still feel the weight of her son's small hands in hers, the way they had looked at her, bewildered. As the officers surrounded them, she rubbed her temples, willing the memory away. But the injustice gnawed at her, restless and unyielding. This was not something she could let pass. She had to ensure there were consequences. In the quiet of her bedroom, she pulled out her laptop and opened a fresh document. Her fingers hovered over the keys, the familiar, cathartic weight of words waiting to pour forth. She had made a career out of crafting arguments, out of shining a light on injustice. But this time, it was personal. She began typing, each word crisp and precise, detailing every moment, every insult wrapped in a smile, every look heavy with doubt. She knew the importance of documentation. This complaint would be a statement, an undeniable record of her truth. In the next room, her sons had finally fallen asleep after a difficult evening. She'd spent hours trying to explain what had happened in ways their young minds could comprehend. Liam had asked question after question, his young voice trembling with anger he didn't yet fully understand. Oliver had remained mostly silent, clinging to her with eyes wide and dark, unable to shake his fear. Every question they'd asked had pricked her heart with fresh pain. How could she explain prejudice in a way that wouldn't break their innocence? Rachel took a deep breath and continued typing, the words flowing with a mix of anger and resolve. The officers would learn that they couldn't harass her, or anyone else, without accountability. She would submit her formal complaint to the department, follow every protocol to the letter, and make certain her voice was heard. When she finally closed her laptop, the quiet around her felt different, heavier. But she knew this was only the beginning. She'd fought too long and too hard to let this pass unnoticed. Underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, Rachel sat with her sons at the breakfast table. The light streaming through the windows was soft and warm, casting a gentle glow over their faces. Liam poked at his cereal, his mind clearly elsewhere, while Oliver clutched his spoon tightly, his small brow furrowed. "Are you okay, Mom?" Liam finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel put down her coffee cup and leaned in closer, smiling softly.
Yes.
"Sweetheart, I'm okay. And we're going to be okay." "But why were those police officers so mean?" he asked, his young voice laced with frustration and confusion. "We didn't do anything wrong." Rachel reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Sometimes people don't see us for who we really are," she said, choosing her words carefully. "They make judgments without knowing the truth. But what's important is that we know who we are, and we don't let anyone else make us feel less than that." Liam nodded. Though Rachel could tell he was still processing it, she turned to Oliver, whose quiet gaze remained fixed on her, and squeezed his hand. "And you know what? We're going to stand up for ourselves. I'm going to make sure those officers understand that what they did was wrong." Oliver nodded, leaning into her touch, his small face beginning to relax as he took in her words. They trusted her completely, and the weight of that trust filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. Underscore 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 underscore. Later that week, Rachel received an email from the police department confirming receipt of her complaint. The investigation had been opened, and the officers in question were put on administrative leave while the case was reviewed. It was a small victory, a first step, but it wasn't enough. Rachel knew the system well. She knew how easily cases like these could be swept under the rug, forgotten in a pile of red tape. But she was prepared to push, to demand justice, for herself and for her children. This fight was just beginning. Meanwhile, the officers, Peterson and Harris, were feeling the weight of the complaint as it rippled through the precinct. Officer Harris, the younger of the two, sat at his desk, his hands wringing nervously as he read the notice of investigation. He replayed the encounter in his mind. Every tense moment, every flash of doubt he had ignored. He had sensed it even then, that they were crossing a line, that they had let their biases cloud their judgment, but he hadn't spoken up.
Now.
He felt the guilt settle over him like a shadow, dark and unrelenting. He glanced over at Peterson, who was pacing across the room, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This is ridiculous," Peterson muttered under his breath, though his voice carried across the room. "It was protocol. We were doing our job." Harris swallowed, choosing his words carefully. "But she was a judge, and we didn't have any real cause," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Maybe we did go too far." Peterson shot him a look of disdain,
His jaw tightening.
"Protocol is protocol. Harris, she should have complied. If she'd just done what we asked, none of this would be happening." Harris looked away, the weight of his partner's words heavy in his chest. He knew that Peterson would never admit his own faults.
would never consider that maybe.
Just maybe. They had overstepped. But Harris couldn't shake the image of Rachel standing there with her children. Her calm resolve. Her quiet dignity. He wondered what kind of man he was. Standing by in silence as prejudice dictated his actions. Underscore 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 underscore. As the investigation moved forward, Rachel felt the support of her community growing. Word had spread about the incident, and people from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own experiences, offering their solidarity. The story had taken on a life of its own, capturing the attention of local news and stirring up conversations on social media. Rachel felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for the support, frustration at the fact that this was even necessary, and a fierce determination to keep fighting. One evening, Rachel sat down with Liam and Oliver, determined to answer their questions as honestly as she could. She knew this was a crucial moment, a chance to teach them the resilience they would need in a world that didn't always see their worth. "Why do we have to fight so hard, Mom?" Liam asked, his young face etched with a mix of anger and sadness. "Why can't people just be fair?" Rachel reached for his hand, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "Because sometimes people let fear or ignorance cloud their judgment. But that's why we have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's unfair." Oliver looked up at her, his wide eyes searching her face. "Will they get in trouble?" Rachel sighed, choosing her words carefully. "They might, and I hope they learn something from this. But more importantly, we're going to keep standing up for ourselves, for what's fair and right. That's how we make the world a better place, little by little." Her sons listened, their young minds trying to grasp the weight of her words. She could see the hurt and confusion still lingering in their eyes. But there was also a flicker of understanding, a small light that told her they were beginning to see what it meant to be strong in the face of adversity. Rachel held them close, her heart swelling with pride and sadness. She had shielded them for as long as she could, but she knew that this lesson, though painful, was one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. They would grow up knowing that strength came not from anger, but from resilience, from standing tall in the face of injustice. And as they drifted off to sleep, Rachel sat in the quiet of their room, the weight of her promise settling over her. This wasn't just about one encounter, or two officers, or even herself. It was about a system that needed change, about a world that had to do better, and she was ready to be a part of that change. For herself, for her sons, and for everyone who had ever faced the same silent battle. The fight for justice was far from over. But Rachel Thompson wasn't backing down. This was only the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. Rachel's resolve was unbreakable. She had spent years building her reputation, fighting for justice and fairness from the bench. But now she was fighting from a different vantage. This wasn't just for her or her sons. It was for everyone who had ever been made to feel powerless under a system that was supposed to protect them. Her fingers moved with practiced speed over her keyboard, crafting the formal complaint with the precision she applied to every case she'd ever handled. Each line was meticulously phrased, detailing the encounter, the officer's assumptions, their baseless demand for her identification, the chilling implications behind every threat and command. She left no room for ambiguity. This document wasn't just a recount of what had happened, it was evidence. A firm stand that screamed, "This cannot and will not be ignored." Once she'd finished, she clicked submit with a deep sense of purpose. She knew what could happen. She knew the backlash, the denial, the resistance she might face. But she had prepared her entire career for this. Rachel understood the system better than anyone. She knew how to use it, how to navigate the inevitable roadblocks and maneuver her way to the truth. And she knew she would not stand alone. Her phone buzzed shortly after. A message from her best friend and fellow attorney, Janet Price. "I heard. I'm with you. Whatever you need." Rachel felt a swell of gratitude, her shoulders softening just slightly. Janet's support was like a lifeline, a reminder that even in the darkest times, she wasn't alone. Underscore 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 underscore. The following day, news of her complaint had spread through her community, taking on a life of its own. Neighbors stopped her on the street, offering words of solidarity, anger, and encouragement. The story rippled outwards. Friends of friends posting on social media, community leaders weighing in, civil rights advocates reaching out. Rachel was overwhelmed but felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't fighting just as an individual now. She was fighting with a wave of people who were equally tired of the prejudice, the quiet injustice simmering under their lives. By that evening, she had received a formal response from the police department. The officers, Peterson and Harris, had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. An inquiry was underway, but Rachel knew how these investigations could go. She knew the difference between the appearance of accountability and real, lasting consequences. The message felt like a small victory, but she wasn't celebrating yet. She knew this was just a single step. To ensure her voice carried, she needed to take her story further.
So,
After putting her boys to bed, she sat at her dining room table with Janet and crafted a letter to the local newspaper. Rachel was careful, her words sharp and unyielding, demanding a full and transparent investigation and calling for systemic change. This was her declaration, a promise to herself and her community that she would not let this go unanswered. Underscore 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 underscore. In the days that followed, her story reached the wider public. The media quickly picked it up, journalists wanting to hear her voice, her experience. As the interviews rolled in, Rachel remained composed and focused, keeping her tone firm and her message clear. This wasn't just about two officers. It was about a system that too often allowed prejudice to flourish unchecked. She was careful not to vilify the police as a whole, but to call out a culture that enabled injustice to linger, a culture that needed to change. Meanwhile, Officers Peterson and Harris were feeling the weight of their actions pressing down on them. Harris, the younger officer, sat in a small, windowless office in the precinct, a place normally used for interrogations. His hands rested on the table, his fingers tapping nervously against the hard surface as he replayed the encounter over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the look on Rachel's face, the calm authority in her eyes, the strength with which she'd spoken. He had felt something then, guilt, maybe even shame, but he hadn't acted on it.
now,
The regret weighed heavily, like a stone lodged in his chest. Peterson
however,
was furious. He paced in the break room, his face flushed with anger. "This is insane," he fumed to another officer. "We were doing our job. It's our protocol to question anyone suspicious. And what does she do? She blows it up, turns it into some civil rights crusade." The other officer shifted uncomfortably, casting a sideways glance at Peterson. "But she's the judge," he said carefully. "And you know, people are paying attention. It might be best to just let this play out." But Peterson was unrelenting, his pride unwilling to admit that maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. "This is all over nothing," he spat. "One complaint from a judge, and suddenly we're the bad guys. It's ridiculous." Harris said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table as he listened to Peterson's rant. He could feel the disconnect growing between them, a widening chasm between Peterson's blind pride and his own gnawing guilt. For the first time, he began to question what he'd accepted, to wonder if maybe he hadn't just followed the wrong orders. Maybe he had failed as a person. Underscore 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 underscore. Rachel's story continued to gain traction, and soon city officials were calling for a formal investigation not only into the officer's actions, but into the culture of the department itself. She was invited to speak at a community meeting, and Rachel knew this was her chance to address the people directly, to ensure that the conversation continued, to transform her experience into a catalyst for change. Standing at the front of the crowded community center, Rachel felt a surge of nerves. But as she looked out at the faces in the audience, friends,
family,
strangers who had come to stand by her side, she felt a swell of courage. This was why she had become a judge, why she had fought so hard to be where she was. Not just to make a name for herself, but to make a difference. She took a deep breath, letting her voice carry through the room, filled with the conviction she felt in her bones. "This isn't just about my family," she began, her gaze steady. "It's about every person who has ever been judged for the color of their skin. Every person who has been questioned, doubted, or dismissed because of something they cannot change." The room was silent, everyone's eyes fixed on her, their expressions filled with empathy, anger, and understanding. Rachel continued, her voice unwavering. "We all deserve to feel safe. We all deserve to walk our own streets without fear. And we deserve a system that protects all of us, equally and without prejudice." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, people nodding, murmuring words of support, determination flickering in their eyes. Rachel felt her own confidence solidify, strengthened by the people who stood with her. As she finished her speech, the applause filled the room, a roar of solidarity that brought tears to her eyes. This was her community, her people, and together, she knew they would make a difference. Underscore 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 underscore.
back at the precinct.
The weight of the investigation grew heavier. Harris was summoned to testify about the incident, his hands clammy as he prepared to answer questions. The shame sat heavy in his chest, a dull ache he couldn't ignore. He had been silent, compliant, and now he was being asked to account for every decision he had made, every word he hadn't spoken. Peterson, however, remained stubborn, defiant, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. His pride was his armor, even as cracks began to show in his confidence, his grip on control slipping as he realized just how much he stood to lose. Underscore 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 underscore. As Rachel returned home that night, the weight of everything settled over her. But it was a weight she bore with pride. She knew this fight was far from over, knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and challenges. But she also knew that she was ready for it. Liam and Oliver greeted her at the door, their young faces lighting up as she entered. She knelt down, pulling them close, feeling the warmth of their small hands and knowing that this, above all, was what she was fighting for, their future. A world where they wouldn't have to fear because of the color of her skin, where they could walk through life with confidence and dignity. As she held them, Rachel made a silent promise to herself and to them. She would not stop. She would keep fighting, keep pushing, until her story became part of a larger change, a movement that would ripple through her community, her city, and beyond. Because Rachel Thompson wasn't just a judge or a mother. She was a voice, a force, a champion for justice. And she knew, without a doubt, that her voice would be heard. Rachel sat in her office, surrounded by files and legal documents. Yet her mind was fixed on a single thought: justice. Her complaint had sparked a fire within the community and beyond, igniting conversations about fairness, integrity, and the insidious grip of prejudice. Calls were pouring into her office from reporters, community leaders, and supporters from across the city. Her story had struck a nerve, and Rachel felt the weight of that responsibility with every message, every shared story of similar encounters.
People were speaking up.
And for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt that this might lead to real change. The formal investigation into Officers Peterson and Harris was progressing faster than anticipated. Rachel's story had galvanized the community, and under the public pressure, the police department's internal affairs had escalated their inquiries. Rachel learned that both officers had been called in for questioning, and Peterson's name had surfaced in past complaints for similar incidents. Though they had never gone this far before, the department issued a statement, a carefully worded message about maintaining trust and ensuring the safety of all citizens.
Yet,
Rachel recognized the vague, defensive tone within it, as if the system was already beginning to protect its own. She'd seen this before: a reluctance to admit fault, a tendency to distance the department from individual cases of misconduct. But this time, she was determined not to let them control the narrative. Underscore 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 underscore. Meanwhile, Peterson and Harris sat in an uncomfortable room at the precinct, awaiting their interviews with Internal Affairs. Peterson's face was a study in defiance, his jaw clenched, his posture rigid. Harris, however, looked defeated, his head down as he fidgeted with his hands. The events of that day weighed heavily on him, and the repeated questioning had forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth of his own role. When he finally entered the small interrogation room, Harris was met by an Internal Affairs officer who introduced herself with a professional smile. "Officer Harris, thank you for being here. We're just looking for an honest account of the events from that day." Harris nodded, his voice quiet as he began recounting the story, each detail unfolding with a growing sense of guilt. We thought she was suspicious because of the call we received," he explained,
his voice faltering.
"But, she was just walking with her kids. And when she told us she was a judge, I don't know why we didn't just let her go." The officer watched him closely, taking notes as he spoke, her pen moving with silent judgment. Harris felt the weight of his actions bearing down on him, and he could almost feel the consequences closing in, one question at a time. "Did you feel that the actions taken were justified?" she asked, her tone pointed yet calm. Harris hesitated, his face pale. "No, ma'am. I think we made a mistake. She was right. We should have backed off. But I didn't speak up." The officer nodded, her expression impassive. But Harris could sense her disapproval. He knew he had failed not just as an officer but as a person, allowing the situation to escalate when he knew in his gut it was wrong. When Peterson entered the room, his attitude was starkly different. He sat down with a defiant look in his eyes, his arms crossed as he leaned back in his chair. "This is a waste of time," he said, a hint of irritation in his voice. "We did our job. There was nothing unusual about it." The Internal Affairs officer looked at him evenly, her pen poised over her notepad. "Officer Peterson, multiple witnesses reported that Judge Thompson was complying with your requests, but that the questioning was prolonged without cause."
"Can you explain that?"
Peterson scoffed, his voice laced with irritation. She was resisting, he said flatly. Just because she's a judge doesn't mean she gets a free pass. Protocol is protocol. The officer's gaze hardened, and Peterson shifted under her stare, the subtle reminder of accountability weighing on him. Thank you, Officer Peterson. Your cooperation is noted. Outside the room, Peterson's face was set in anger, his steps heavy. Harris watched him, feeling the gap between them widen. They had both entered that day as a team.
But now,
Harris saw just how differently they viewed their actions. Underscore 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 underscore. At home, Rachel received updates on the investigation from her lawyer, who detailed each step with precision. The investigation was moving forward, and the weight of the officers' testimonies, coupled with community pressure, was forcing the department to examine their own biases and protocols more closely. Rachel felt the beginnings of satisfaction, a glimmer of hope that this wasn't just another case that would be swept under the rug. One afternoon, she received a call from the head of the city's Civil Rights Commission, inviting her to participate in a community forum addressing racial bias in law enforcement. It was an opportunity she couldn't ignore, a chance to share her experience and speak directly to the people who were ready to make change happen. Underscore 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 underscore. The night of the forum, Rachel stood backstage, waiting to take the stage. Her heart pounded as she looked out over the packed auditorium, where hundreds of people Saturday waiting to hear from her and other community leaders who had been impacted by prejudice in the system. She caught a glimpse of Janet in the front row, her smile steady, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. As she stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the crowd, and she took a deep breath, her voice calm yet resolute. "Thank you for being here," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "What happened to my family wasn't an isolated incident. It's a reality that far too many people in our community face, and it's a reality that must change." The crowd's eyes remained fixed on her, their expressions a blend of hope, frustration, and empathy. "We need accountability," she continued, her voice rising with conviction. "We need transparency. But more than that, we need people in positions of authority to see every single person for who they are, not for the assumptions and biases that cloud their judgment." Applause erupted from the audience, and Rachel felt a surge of energy as she continued, drawing strength from the crowd's support. This was her chance to speak for the voiceless, to give a name and a face to the stories that so often went untold. As she left the stage, she was greeted by a wave of people who shared their own stories, their own moments of injustice and resilience. Each face, each handshake, strengthened her resolve to continue her fight. Underscore 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 underscore. The next day, the department released a statement pledging to implement new training programs focused on implicit bias and fair policing practices. The statement was met with both applause and skepticism, as many in the community felt it was only a small step in the right direction. Rachel watched the news from her office, a mix of hope and caution tugging at her. This was a win, a step forward, but she knew it was only a small part of a much larger journey. The battle for real, systemic change was far from over, but she felt more determined than ever to see it through. That evening, as she sat with Liam and Oliver at the dinner table, they listened as she explained what had happened, how their experience was making a difference. We're helping change things,
Boys, she said.
smiling softly as she brushed a lock of hair from Liam's face. What happened to us, it's going to help make the world better. Liam's eyes brightened, and he looked at her with pride. So, it was worth it, he asked, his young voice filled with a tentative hope. Rachel took his hand, her voice soft but strong.
Yes.
Sweetheart, it was worth it. Every step, every word, every fight we take on, it's all worth it. As she tucked them in that night, Rachel felt a deep, quiet sense of accomplishment. She knew the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. That prejudice was a stubborn force to fight, but she had made her stand, and she had begun to shift the tide, even if only a little. And with her sons safely sleeping, their faces peaceful, she felt renewed in her purpose. She would not stop, not until every person could walk without fear, live without judgment, and grow without the weight of prejudice pressing down on them. Rachel Thompson knew her fight was only beginning, but she was ready for it, fueled by the love for her family and the hope of a world where justice was truly blind. Weeks passed, and Rachel's fight for justice had continued to ripple outward, creating waves she could never have anticipated. Her story had sparked a citywide movement, with communities organizing to demand accountability, equality, and meaningful change. Rachel had always believed in the power of justice, but she was learning that justice meant so much more than one case, one complaint. It was the voice of every person who stood up, who refused to be silenced, who knew that the world could and should be better. As the investigation into Officers Peterson and Harris drew to a close, Rachel received the call she'd been waiting for. She answered quickly, her heart pounding, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the phone to her ear. Her attorney, Janet, spoke with a mixture of relief and satisfaction in her voice. Rachel, the verdict is in. The department has decided to take disciplinary action against both officers. Janet announced. Peterson has been suspended without pay and is facing demotion. Harris will also be reprimanded and enrolled in a mandatory bias training program. Rachel closed her eyes, letting out a long breath. It wasn't the complete victory she had hoped for, but it was a step forward, a small yet meaningful acknowledgement that change was possible. She thanked Janet, feeling a swell of gratitude for her friend's unwavering support. Janet had stood by her side from the very beginning, offering not just legal advice but strength, a reminder that she was never alone in this journey. As she hung up, a sense of closure washed over her, though it was tinged with a bittersweet edge. She knew that disciplinary actions alone would not erase what had happened to her, what had happened to so many others. But it was a beginning, a promise that things could be different. Underscore 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 underscore. That evening, Rachel returned home to find her boys waiting for her with eager faces. As though they could sense that something important had happened, she pulled them close, embracing them tightly as they nestled into her arms, their small bodies warm and trusting.
Mom.
Did we win? Oliver asked, looking up at her with wide eyes. Rachel knelt down so she could meet his gaze, smiling softly as she nodded.
Yes, we did.
And it's not just a win for us, sweetheart. It's a win for everyone who deserves to be treated fairly, who deserves respect. Liam, who had been quiet, looked at her with a mixture of awe and determination. Does this mean other people won't be treated that way anymore? Rachel's heart ached with both pride and sorrow. She knew she couldn't promise a perfect world, but she could promise that she would keep fighting for one. It means we're closer to that, Liam. And every time someone stands up for what's right, We get closer still." The boys smiled, and Rachel felt a flicker of hope spark in her heart. This experience, as painful as it had shown her children the power of resilience, the strength it took to stand up even when the world seemed to push back. They had witnessed her struggle, her fight,
And now,
they could see what courage looked like, what justice felt like. Underscore 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 underscore. The following weekend, Rachel attended a community rally, one of the many gatherings that had sprung up across the city as her story became a symbol of hope and change. She stood among neighbors, friends, and strangers who had come together in solidarity, their faces filled with the same quiet determination she had felt when she'd filed her complaint. Janet joined her, a proud smile lighting up her face as she placed a supportive hand on Rachel's shoulder. "This is because of you,"
Janet said.
her voice filled with warmth. "You've shown people what's possible when we stand up and refuse to back down." Rachel looked out over the crowd, feeling a surge of gratitude. She knew that change was a collective effort, that each person in that crowd played a role in building a world where everyone could feel safe, valued,
And seen.
She took the stage, the microphone buzzing softly as the crowd's murmurs quieted. Taking a deep breath, she looked out over the people gathered, their faces a tapestry of shared experience, of hope, of strength. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady, carrying the weight of all they had fought for. "What happened to my family was wrong, but what came out of it was something I could never have imagined. Each of you, standing here, is a reminder that we don't face these battles alone." Applause rippled through the crowd, but Rachel raised her hand gently, her expression calm and resolute. "This isn't the end. It's the beginning of something bigger, something that we can all be a part of. We've proven that change can happen, but it's up to us to keep that change alive." The applause swelled, louder now, a roar of solidarity that echoed through the streets, a testament to the power of a community that refused to be silenced. Rachel stood tall, her heart swelling with pride as she realized the enormity of what they were building together. It was a movement that would continue long after this day, a movement fueled by the dreams and voices of everyone there. Underscore 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 underscore. As the crowd dispersed, Rachel walked through the streets with her boys, the early evening light casting a warm glow over the city. She held their hands, feeling the quiet peace that had been missing since the ordeal began. She had shown her sons the importance of standing up for what was right, and they had taught her the true meaning of resilience, of love, of family. Liam looked up at her, his face filled with a wisdom beyond his years.
"Mom,
"Do you think they'll remember what happened?" Rachel looked down at him, smiling softly as she nodded.
yes."
"They will. And maybe, just maybe, it'll help them see things differently. Help them do better." Oliver squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed ahead as he walked beside her. "I'm proud of you,
Mom."
Her heart swelled, and she blinked back tears, a mixture of pride, love, and gratitude. "Thank you, Oliver. I'm proud of you both, too." As they walked, Rachel felt a sense of closure, a peace that had settled over her like a soft blanket. She knew there would be more battles, more moments of injustice, but she also knew she would face them with the same strength that had carried her through this one. She glanced down at her sons, their faces illuminated in the fading light, and knew that she had given them a powerful gift, the knowledge that they were strong, that they were worthy, and that they could make a difference. And with that knowledge, she knew they would grow into men who would carry forward her fight, men who would stand up for justice, kindness, and equality. As they turned down the familiar path toward home, Rachel felt the weight of the past weeks lift from her shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready for it, ready to keep fighting, to keep building a world where her children and everyone else's could live without fear, without judgment, without prejudice. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and lavender. And as they stepped through their front door, Rachel felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was only the beginning, a new dawn, and she was ready to face it with open arms,
With her family by her side.
and with hope lighting the path forward.